Thank you very much, Prahash, and the SMU team again for inviting me to this talk. I think I see some of your names are quite familiar. I believe we interacted before in the previous session, and I know there was this career session that you did last time. So anyway, I take this very seriously. I enjoy speaking with young people, students, right, on talks like these, right? So I guess keep your questions coming. Feel free to drop them in the chat. I want to have some Q&A with all of you as well. So I've invited my co-author and my colleague Donovan Choy here, who will also be co-speaking with me. So I think we both share the same positions on this topic. So we will, take turns to share our thoughts. Today's talk is really about behavioral economics, the use of big data tools in public policy, and linking the Singapore context. So I think we will be doing a short presentation through the slides here. We'll be sharing about what behavioral economics is all about, what are its implications when it comes to public policy, how this is different from mainstream economics, right? And what are our views on behavioral economics, and how does Singapore fit into all this picture here, right? I think Donovan, you can go ahead and begin.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I guess maybe before I start, my computer is having some problems. So if I do fall out suddenly, I think Brian, you can just pick back up. But so I guess I want to say to everyone that's in the call today, right, that our presentation is primarily going to be a critique of behavioral economics. So if you have a background in behavioral econ, it'll be useful. It'll be a little bit more easy for you to understand where we are coming from. But nonetheless, on the very first slide here, so we're going to go through very briefly what behavioral economics is and how exactly does it position itself. So behavioral economics is in the mainstream today, right? And I think they have several Nobel Prize winners. And essentially, how I would characterize behavioral economics is this: it's a discipline of economics that positions itself away from mainstream neoclassical economics in terms of human rationality, right? Can you go to the next slide? So the idea is that behavioral economics is saying, hey, you guys who have been in the mainstream econ for so long, right? People don't actually behave as a rational men, in other terms, Homo economicus, right? And behavioral economics is bringing these insights from psychology and the other areas of the social sciences and saying that people actually behave in all kinds of flawed and biased and misguided ways that does not align with the neoclassical conception of Homo economicus. So on the slide here, so basically what behavioral economics is saying is that Homo economicus is unrealistic. In the real world, people don't behave like that. And that's where the whole onus for the whole idea of nudging comes in. It's because people are behaving irrationally. It's because people are deviating from this Homo economicus norm. And that's why governments have some kind of a role to play to push consumers towards making more optimal decisions than they currently are.
That's right. And I think we should understand what Homo economicus is in the first place, right? So that's the conception of man that mainstream economics is, right? So mainstream economics sees human beings as fully rational, right? And you are making choices, right, to maximize your utility, right? So that simply means, right, you have perfect information about all the different choices and opportunities in front of you, and you are able to do a cost-benefit analysis of each choice, and you go for the choice and the option that has the most profit, which in this case is utility, right? So you're going to weigh cost-benefit analysis for every single alternative, and you will go literally for the most optimal choice, right? You will do this in all your decision making. So mainstream economics sees human beings as behaving, right? And if you extrapolate Homo economics, then you will see that the market is also somehow behaving in a fully rational way, right? So that's why neoclassical mainstream economics assumes certain conditions, right? That markets are perfectly competitive, right? There's perfect information. Buyers and sellers have perfect information about all the economic choices available to them, right? Yeah, so that's the picture of the market that mainstream economics has. And as Donovan rightly pointed out, behavioral economics challenges this, right, from a psychological paradigm, showing that in reality, human beings don't really operate this way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have here like it's a little bit small, but essentially the point of this chart is to illustrate if you actually what you guys can do is to just go to Wikipedia and look at like the list of biases and heuristics that behavior economics has came up with. There's literally a list that is nearing 200 different heuristics. So at that kind of length of so-called biases, right? There's practically anything that you want to claim that if you want to use some kind of heuristic to prove that people are behaving irrationally, there probably is something already out there that justifies your argument, right? Okay, go to the next slide. So behavioral economics has its influence is quite pervasive. It goes far beyond just academia. If you look at this book that I've put down here, this is published by the OECD, right? It's a very good comprehensive book of hundreds of case studies around the world where policymakers have actually tried to construct nudge units and along the lines of consumer protection, labor market protection, environmental protection, and financial services. So the classic example of, for those who are not familiar with like the idea of nudging, the classic example is this. When it comes to financial services, when it comes to saving money, behavioral economists are very concerned with the way that people are basically not saving enough money for a rainy day, right? As soon as I get my paycheck, I'm going to splurge it. And when shit hits the fan, when I need to have a medical surgery or I need my money, I don't have my money. So behavioral economists point at this and say, look, that's an example of a consumer that's behaving irrationally, right? So if you look at this book and you look at the chapters on financial services, you will find all kinds of case studies of how behavioral economists and policymakers are trying to ensure that people save enough for when they need it eventually. And environmental protection is all about like pushing drivers to get towards like less less energy pollutant kinds of fuels, and labor market protections is just to do with like hiring in HR. So I think there's no doubt at all that the influence of behavioral economics is very, very pervasive. And later on in the slides, we'll talk a little bit about how the Singapore government themselves have deployed behavioral economics even before the whole mainstream ascendancy of behavioral economics in academia, right? It has definitely gotten a bit more traction today, but yeah, go ahead.
That's a very good point. Even myself, when I was in the government for some time, we always learn about behavioral insights and how do you basically frame options, right, for citizens so it's palatable to them, so we can influence citizens, right, to make the choices that we actually want them to do, right? So, I think there's some very famous examples some of you may be familiar with or came across. So I think in Singapore there is this thing called the Human Organ Transplant Act, right? Because we want to have a supply of organs, right, in cases whereby we need to do transplants, right? So by default, right, every citizen in Singapore, right, you are assumed to be in this program unless you specifically opt out of this, right? So the government actually framed the policy such that you are assumed to be in unless you explicitly choose to be out of it, right? Rather than presenting it as a choice for you to opt in, right? Most people will not want to opt into a program by you're telling the government, hey, if anything happens to me, you can take my organs and give it to someone else, right? So you are assumed to be in a program unless you sign a form and tell the government, no, I choose not to do so. So basically, the situation is the same. You still have the freedom, right? To withdraw your participation. But because the government framed the choice in a different way, right, it is able to garner higher participation, right, of Singaporeans on this Human Organ Transplant Act program. Yeah. right? And of course, even the Ministry of Health, the Health Promotion Board, when it comes to presenting healthy diet choices, right, in food courts, in restaurants, right, the way colors are used, the way you present the menus, right, all these are all very visual tweaks they are doing to kind of influence your choices, right, so that you will buy healthy foods, as it
Mm.
were, right? So it really spans a range of policy areas. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Donovan, you want to continue this?
Yeah, sure. So in the book that Bryan and I have written, and it's going to publish end of the year, one of the chapters looks particularly at how behavioral economics has influenced Singapore policy making. And particularly, there are two dominant strands of thought in Singapore. The first is this, what you see on the slide right now, what is called the risk assessment and horizon scanning, short for RAS, right? So what RAS is essentially trying to do, this is the pet project of Peter Ho, who was the former head of civil service. What Peter Ho is essentially trying to do is that he's trying to introduce big data kind of tools into policy making. The argument is this: the world is, as we live in today, is too complex, right? We no longer live like 50 years ago, where labor markets were generally predictable, goods, the flows of goods were predictable. Today, the international market is so complex, and due to technological improvements in communications and transport, it is very difficult for policymakers to actually plan the economy in a way that is efficient. So what Peter Ho is trying to do here is, so he borrows from the writer Nassim Taleb this term, right, what he calls black swans. Some of you might be familiar with it. Essentially, black swans are unpredictable events, terrorist attacks, the COVID-19 outbreak, natural disasters. And what Peter Ho is trying to do here is to bring in this whole conception of if we have a big enough data set, if we have these technologies, we can be able to somehow plan the economy in a way that is that does not lead to catastrophic breakdowns in the economy, right? So, um, and then the second strand of thought, you want to take this one, Bryan, on the next slide?
I think before we move on, I just want to share a bit about Ross, the background of Ross. So I would encourage all of you to do a Google search, maybe reader, right, called The Social Laboratory. It's an article that was run by Foreign Policy magazine, investigating this Ross system in Singapore. Basically, this is a tool that the government is using to engage in what they call scenario planning, right? As you know, Singapore government always claims to be very forward-looking, right? We do not want to do policy making just for 1 year, 2 years basis. We want to have all the data that we need so that we can plan society and public policies in a rational way for as long a term as possible, right? So the risk assessment horizon scanning system, it kind of originated, right, in the wake of SARS in 2003, because SARS was a black swan event that hit Singapore and we were unprepared for it. So since SARS, right, Peter Ho led this department, led this team, right? I mean, even before SARS, we've always been doing scenario planning in the government sectors. But since then, right, there's been renewed focus on this, you know. So scenario planning will be things like, using big data analytics, right, to analyze trends, past trends, extrapolating to the future, right? Getting a bunch of civil servants together and to discuss possible scenarios of what could happen in future, and then kind of backtracking and say, how can we put in place policies today that will secure Singapore's future for tomorrow, right? So this is the first strand. It is related to behavioral economics, right?
Yep. So
Um,
you
go on.
want me to take this one?
Yeah.
So the second strand of behavioral economics is led by Donald Low, has written this very influential book on behavioral economics. And I think this is being pushed out through the civil service college, yes. And if you look at this book, it's essentially an analysis of Singapore policy through a very behavioral economic lens. So what Bryan was talking about earlier about how organ transplants of like opting people in. So the book looks at a lot of examples of Singapore policy and says, hey, you know what, actually, PAP has been doing behavioral economics, has been introducing behavioral economic insights into policymaking for a long time. Another example is for some of you who might be familiar with social welfare policy, right? Um, you know
Yes.
about these, yeah, you know about these groups, Mendaki and Sinda in Singapore. These are like your race-based social welfare groups. So essentially, these groups are funded, right, through a very, very little known mechanism. If you're working, the government actually takes like something like 20 cents out of your paycheck without telling you, right? And then they put it into these, they fund it to these welfare groups. And you can, of course, go up to your boss and say, hey, you know what, 20 cents is a lot to me, and I want to keep that money for myself. But of course, no one is going to be, most people, I assume, are not going to be cheapskate enough to do that. So this is another example of how policymakers are using automatic enrollment to overcome what behavioral economists call some kind of inertia to engaging in more optimal options.
So I think
And
if all of you are familiar with Donald Low, he has written quite a number of books, right? He has recently been in the news this week as well because disinvited from his webinar. I think that was very unfortunate of that incident. So I think Donald Low's different books, right? Some are a bit more normative, whereby he's making recommendations about how Singapore's public policies should be. For example, his famous book called Hard Choices, Challenging the Singapore Consensus, is a more normative book. This book, however, is a bit more descriptive. It's talking about how Singapore government is operating using behavioral economics. So I think our book, right, actually engages with Donald Lu on many levels, both on a descriptive level as well as on a normative level. Yeah.
so the reason why we have Bryan and I in our book, we have sort of merged Donald Low and Peter Ho together and into one chapter, is because both strands of thoughts are directly influenced by the insights from behavioral economics. Both Donald Low and Peter Ho are saying that people behave irrationally in all kinds of ways that behavioral economics, economists and psychologists have been talking about for many, many years, right? Our only difference, and this is on the third bullet point here, is that Donald Low is analyzing how consumers are behaving irrationally, whereas Peter Ho is saying, you know what, the world is so complex. If we still want to plan the Singapore economy well, policymakers need to undergo this whole course of like scenario planning, which is to say to prepare them for these kinds of black swan events. So these are two examples of how behavioral economics has a very, very direct influence on our policy making here today.
Yeah. However, I think Donovan and I, we have some criticisms against this school of thought called behavioral economics, and we're just going to explain them step by step. I think, firstly, there is a theoretical problem, right? Because even though behavioral economics challenges mainstream economics, right, it still remains wedded to the same normative benchmark, right? It still expects individuals to operate according to the requirements of neoclassical economic framework. So I think there's a little bit of irony here. Let's explain to you what that means. So behavioral economics says individuals are not fully rational, right? So that means you are not Superman, but they are somehow expected to be rational, failing which there is a case for government intervention. There is a case for nudging to make sure you fulfill the standards of Superman, which you fall short from.
Right.
Failure to achieve full rationality constitutes a form of market failure. Yeah.
Right. Exactly right. So the best, the most sort of analogy that we try to make here is that essentially behavioral economics is telling you this: Homo economicus is unrealistic. It does not describe real world individuals, but yet if you deviate from that benchmark, then there is something wrong with that. And that's where the whole onus for nudging comes in, right? So for those of you who have studied econs, you'll be very familiar with the notion of market failures. Market failures goes back all the way to the 40s and 50s. So probably most of you would be familiar with Ekelov's famous paper on like the lemon markets, right? What he's saying is that um, markets tend to have some kind of information asymmetry, and consumers are because they are left in they have less information than producers do. It leads to some kind of market failure breakdown, because over time the superior products will leave the market. So it's very similar. It's a very subtle similarity, right? Is to what behavioral economics is saying today. Welfare economists, the market failure guys 50 years ago, they were saying that markets have a failure when they deviate from the model of perfect competition. But now behavioral economists is using the exact same kind of analytical tool to talk about individuals. When you deviate from Homo economicus, then there is some kind of quote unquote decision-making failure, right? And that's why we use this example of like, you are not Superman, but then you are still going to be judged according to those standards, which is the first problem with behavioral economics.
That's right. So I think
And
to reassure everyone that we are not trying to go against a straw man argument, this is something that is actually stated in the books and writings of the behavioral economists.
yeah,
Donovan, explain that.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
that.
So so Dan Ariely is a very famous behavioral economist up at Duke, I believe. So I won't read through the whole quote, but just pay attention to the ones in bold, right? So Ariely explicitly says, yes, a free market based on supply, demand, and no friction would be the ideal if we were truly rational, right? And what is that? That is essentially the perfect competition model that we learn in Econ 101. Can you flash the next quote as well? Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein. Richard Taylor won the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics, I think it was 2018 or 17. And look at what he says as well. In some cases, people make inferior choices, choices they would change if they had complete information, unlimited cognitive abilities, and no lack of willpower. See, again, the benchmark is Homo economicus, right? And finally, on the next slide, we have another example of a prominent behavioral economist, Colin Cameron and George Loewenstein. Again, look at this is even more explicit this time. In the words in bold, this conviction does not imply a wholesale rejection of the neoclassical approach based on utility maximization, equilibrium, and efficiency. The neoclassical approach is useful because it provides economists with a theoretical framework that can be applied to almost any form of economic behavior, and it makes refutable predictions. This textbook that you see here is one of like the most pivotal textbooks that they use in behavioral economic classes, right? So the point here is that we are trying to stress a very subtle methodological point. Behavioral economics, for all their criticism of mainstream econs, for all their criticism of neoclassical econs, they are still somewhat wedded to that paradigm. They are not completely detached from it. They are just saying that we have some problems with it, but you know what? We are still playing within the same rules of the game. And
Right.
that's why on this slide, I actually included a Milton Friedman quote, right? And it's very technical. I'm not going to read it. But essentially, Milton Friedman would have more or less agreed with a lot of what behavioral economists were saying today if he was still alive. Milton Friedman was the most, I mean, behavioral economists, when they are criticizing neoclassical econs, right? Milton Friedman is like the guy that they are all like pointing to and saying, hey, you know what? This whole thing is wrong, and this all came from Friedman. But if you look at Friedman's methodological papers, he was saying the exact same thing, that like the whole paradigm of economics, the whole purpose of it is to make predictions, right? And to make predictions within a whole set of assumptions, such as Homo economicus, perfect competition, firms are all price takers. And so it's not really that much, it's not really that big of a deviation from neoclassical econs.
So I guess, if what we are saying is true, then that means is behavioral economics really that revolutionary anyway, right? Or is it
Mm.
simply just an extension or reiteration of neoclassical economics in a different garb, right? So I think that's what we are trying to say, right?
Mm. Yeah. And then it comes into the whole normative implications of the behavioral economics project, which is that, okay, people are behaving irrationally. Now we need to start, policymakers need to start nudging them. And this is where I think free market economists, free market leading people, such as Bryan and myself, this is where we have a problem with the whole paradigm, right? Because the whole methodological setup is set up in a way that you can't be proven wrong. Of course, if your benchmark is Superman, then of course you're going to win your argument, right? I mean, who here is as perfect as Superman? No one is as perfect as Superman, right? And this is why Deirdre McCloskey, right? She's a very famous economic historian. She has labeled behavioral economics the applied theory of bossing people around, right? Because as long as you are sitting on your pedestal where you look down and you see a whole bunch of irrational behavior, there's always going to be some onus for you to nudge people. And this is where behavioral economists come in with the whole. Some of you might be familiar with this, but behavioral economists have called themselves libertarian paternalists, right? So it's like a middle ground between the hardline kind of paternalists, such as chewing gum is bad. I'm going to ban it straight off the rack. And the other side, which is, you know what, chewing gum might be bad, but people have the freedom to make choices. Behavioral economists try to position themselves along this spectrum in the middle, and that's why they call themselves libertarian paternalists. We are still paternalistic in some sense, but we are also trying to give people some scope of freedom to make their own consumer choices.
However, this
And
still
yep.
falls within, right, a framework of paternalism, right? Paternalism, which is the idea that, individuals may not be able to make the best choices for themselves, and we have to make some choices on their behalf, right? So I think all of you, we've heard the common, perception and phrasing that Singapore PAP government is paternalistic. We are this nanny state. So if you think about the nature of the PAP, the way our governance has been structured, and think about what behavioral economics is all about, based on what we presented, it is no surprise. It is no surprise and no coincidence, right, that the PAP government and civil servants have jumped on this bandwagon called behavioral economics because it provides them with the theoretical justification as well as the tools, right, to engage in the forms of paternalism that they have always been doing for a very long time.
Right, exactly right.
So the next problem is, even though there's this theoretical problem, right, there's also this kind of empirical problem here, in a sense. If let's say you're judging the market for being imperfect, right? Individuals are, imperfect, not Superman. Then the question is, when the government tries to correct the market failures and correct these, failures in rationality, right? Is the government going to do a better job? Is the government itself Superman? Right? Is the question we're trying to ask. So one of the problems, right, that behavioral economics fails to consider is that the political process, which is in many countries based on representative democracy, has many problems and many failures, which can lead to some very suboptimal outcomes as well. It can lead to some very irrational outcomes as well, which could potentially be worse than the irrational market outcome that you were trying to correct in the first place, right? So this is called, the nirvana fallacy, whereby we try to compare an perfect situation with an unrealistic ideal, which does not exist, which does not happen, right? So behavioral economics, right, is guilty of this nirvana fallacy because it focuses on the failures of market participants, of firms, of consumers, but not realizing that public choice economics, for example, tells us that in the policy arena, in the political arena, politicians, civil servants, bureaucrats, they are also following their self-interest, and many times, they have their own agendas, and this may not lead to very good outcomes. Right? Donovan, you want to continue this?
Yeah, can you flash the rest of the slide? So I know I think you captured it quite well. So basically, what we're trying to say here is that is the kind of very simple way to think about it is like, if a parent were to take care of their child, we probably wouldn't have much objections because the parent is obviously a grown adult. He or she is in a much better position to advise the child. But when we talk about government intervention, right, nudging and or any kinds of interventionism in politics, there tends to be this assumption that the political process, right, the politics, the state is this black box which is assumed to be smooth functioning, which is assumed to be populated with good intentioned people and not have any kinds of problems of itself. And as long as you have this kind of like assumption, right, it's very easy for you to just say, oh, there's a problem in the market, government should intervene. And even if you may believe this, I will concede, right, that the Singaporean government is relatively much more efficient than many other countries. But
That's
then
right.
if you are looking at a country like, say, the US, where politics is so captured by corporate interests, right, where if you try to have some kind of a sugar tax, um, probably being pushed by health experts or health lobby groups, you will get pushback from the sugar lobby groups. And there's this whole very complex process, right, in politics where there's this tug of war and push and underhand under table dealings. So when you look at these democratic polities, right, there's so much problems that should give you caution to saying that, oh, you know what, there's a problem, the government should intervene. Because if the political process is so flawed and it's so inefficient, you should be very careful about what you kinds of decisions you want to entrust into the political arena.
Yeah, and this problem comes back to the phenomenon of the tyranny of the minority, actually. Tyranny of the minority, which is that if you follow, economists like Menke Olson, for example, famous economists, they talk about the influence of special interest groups because there are special interest groups, right, who feel very strongly about a particular policy because they get a lot of benefits which are concentrated on them. So they are very well organized. They spend lots of effort, time, and resources, right? And they have the ability to influence government policies. But individual consumers and taxpayers like you and I, right? Our individual cost is very small, right? So we don't have the same level of organizational capacity, right, to counter organize, which is why in many democratic countries, right, is sometimes not really the majority that rules, it's the minority special interest groups, right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
So I think that was the incentive problems, right, that we see in the democratic process. But there's also a knowledge problem with knowledge when it comes to when it comes to government policy. So governments, they also lack the knowledge needed to correct the market process. Yes, the market is imperfect, but is government always smarter than the many people who populate the market? Government may itself be subject to bounded rationality, right? Which is a concept in political science and economics. It's been there. So how do free market economists respond to the challenge posed by behavioral economics? And this is where I want to introduce to all of you this very famous Jewish economist called Israel Kirzner from New York University. So, we agree with his paradigm. So we operate, Donovan and I, we operate under this school of thought. So we agree with behavioral economists. We agree that humans are imperfect. We agree that markets do not operate based on those perfect conditions. But unlike behavioral economists, we don't think that's a problem, right? We don't think that's a problem. In fact, right, we think it's precisely because individuals are not fully rational, it is precisely because there's so much uncertainty. That's actually why we need markets. So the reason for markets, right, does not rest on neoclassical Homo economicus. Markets, right, is precisely the mechanism that we need to deal with the problem, of lack of knowledge, of irrationality, right? So markets do not work only when everyone is fully rational. In fact, right, it's precisely because there's so much uncertainty that we need markets to facilitate a process of discovery, right? It's what my supervisor likes to call a process of trial and error learning, right? So think of, a science laboratory, right? We do not know what are the innovations that will come 5 months down the road. We do not know, what vaccines are going to arise, right? In the trial and error process. But it's precisely because we don't know that we need different scientists, we need different pharmaceutical companies to try out different solutions, right, to compete against one another. And over time, we have more information, we have better and better information, right? So this is the evolutionary. It's evolutionary, right? It's an evolutionary process that we see in market competition, right? Donovan, you want to complete this point?
Yeah, I guess I just want to emphasize something that you have already mentioned, and is that a lot of I guess left-leaning intellectuals, thinkers, and economists, they tend to caricature all the people on the free market side as being some kind of a disciple of Milton Friedman, which is that if you believe in free markets, you believe that you automatically subscribe to that whole neoclassical model of perfect competition, and that is not true.
That's not.
Israel Kirzner is from the Austrian School of Economics, which is a very free market leaning school, and they themselves have major methodological disagreements with the Chicago School of Economics. This is your Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Gary Becker. All these are Nobel Prize winning economists, very free market, and all subscribed within the perfect competition paradigm. And yeah, and exactly. I think that's all I wanted to add. Yeah,
So
and
Donovan,
and
need the
yeah.
three P.
So yeah, I'll take this one. So if you look at if you sometimes if you read like op-eds, right, especially on very left-leaning news sites, you will see this caricature that I was just talking about, which is that, oh, you're a free market guy, you're a neoliberal, that means that you are so naive to believe that markets will auto-correct themselves or will self-regulate. And that's just not what at least Bryan and I, or economists from the Austrian school, believe. So what this slide does is to try and unpack exactly how is it that markets tend to self-regulate without just assuming it away, right? So someone like from the Chicago School of Economics would just assume that markets will auto-regulate. But this slide, what it does to try to do is to explain how exactly what are the mechanisms that allow for this kind of self-correction and coordination of different goals in the economy. So the three P's equal to three I's model is essentially saying that first you need to have property rights. When you have property rights, then you have the incentive to invest. If you are living in Singapore, you won't hesitate about wanting to buy a piece of property. Why? Because the rule of law is very strong in Singapore. If someone tries to steal your property or vandalize it, you know that you can go and seek redress to the courts. But probably won't have the same kind of thinking if you were in a developing country where property rights are very, very unstable, right? And you can think about the same way in a very socialist economy where people basically don't have property rights, right? So if everything is commonly owned by the commune or the government, then there's not really any kind of incentive for me as an entrepreneur to want to invest in capital. Because if I do invest, at the end of the day, it's going to get taxed away or taken away. So the incentive, right? This is where the first P leads to the first I, right? And then on the second P is on prices. So the price system is a very, very I would say it's a very common insight in economics, but unfortunately in popular discourse, you don't really see much appreciation of it. So what prices do is essentially gives us the second I, which is information. Let's say that you are an entrepreneur and you are in the business of manufacturing, say, furniture tables, I don't know, made of some kind of special kind of oak. But your business depends, right, on importing huge amounts of this oak. And you know that if you can get it at, say, $100 per kilogram, right, for example, you know that this is where the sweet spot where you can import enough for your business to work. But then one day you wake up and you see that the prices have changed. Now the price of oak has risen to, say, $150. You don't know what the reason is, okay? You don't know if it's because of some forest fire somewhere. Is it because of some war? Is it because there are some new technological improvements in the background? But what the price system does is that it allows people in the economy to change their plans based on just looking at prices. Okay, so maybe there's a shortage. I need to change my the material that I'm going to use to manufacture my furniture, and that's the importance of the price system, right? And then finally, on the last P, which is a very vilified word today, profits. But essentially, why free market economists always stress that profits is very important, right? Is that without profiting, without the profit mechanism, will be no way for us to distinguish between economic projects that get it right and economic projects that get it wrong. So, for example, um, you can think of it as like a failing business that the government subsidizes. What happens when the government says, hey, you know what? There are so many jobs that depend on your company or on your industry. We can't let you fail. You're too big to fail. And then governments will start enacting all kinds of subsidies to your company. What that essentially does is that it disrupts the profit mechanism, because now the profits no longer truly reflect that an entrepreneur is selling goods that meets what consumers value, right? You're just using tax dollars to subsidize your business. So without the profit mechanism, you can never know which businesses are actually doing something right and which businesses are doing something wrong.
This
And
actually
that's what,
back down to learning process that I was describing in the previous slide, right? So how do we know, which economic projects are worthwhile to invest in, right? We have to see, because we don't know. We do not know what industries, what technologies are going to be the wave of the future, right? But it's precisely because we have different firms, different people trying out different ideas. Some are going to be profitable, some are going to lose out, right? And so profit loss is actually a learning mechanism. Right? Without it, right, we cannot, have economic progress, essentially.
right, exactly right. So I just want to stress one thing here, right? That I think a lot of people, when they hear the word profit, they tend to be like, oh, what you mean? What you mean? You want to have like rich people be able to like just like practice unbridled greed, right? And that really is not what we are saying here, right? The point is we are we need the profit mechanism, not because we are encouraging greed or any kind of like such values. The profit mechanism tells us something about what people are doing correctly and what people are doing wrong. If they are doing something wrong, they should be allowed to fail. That business should fold. Because if you prop that business up artificially, you are in effect wasting resources that could have went to a better use, right? You're in effect wasting resources that could have that serve somebody else better.
I think that's a great
So,
difference. We are
yep,
pro-market, but we're not necessarily pro-business, right? Because a lot of big businesses, they are sometimes anti-market, right? A lot of big businesses, right, they do not like markets actually, because they do not like competition. They want to be protected. They want to be subsidized. They want to be insulated, right, by a lot of government privileges. So in fact, right, if we have this system, right, a lot more in many countries, a lot of businesses, right, may not actually sustain itself, right? Because they'll be subject to the tough process of competition in this case.
right. And I think what essentially this slide, again to summarize, what this slide is trying to do is to unpack what exactly is it that free market economists are saying when we say that we should let the market process unfold, right? It's not some kind of naive belief grounded in kind of like oh, you know what, people are just smart in the market and everything will work out fine eventually. This slide here is the conceptual meat to how exactly the markets function, and why is it that it mitigates for social complexity and human error, which is in the top, the title of the slide.
Donovan?
Yep. So Hayek, F.A. Hayek, he's a Nobel Prize winner, very famous Austrian free market economist, and essentially what one of like very fundamental insights of Hayek is that he tries to unpack what exactly is the role of market competition. Okay, so remember, right, when we talk about market competition, if you take an Econ 101 class, there's literally no explanation of what exactly market competition is. It's just assume that market competition is a thing that happens, and it's a thing that tends towards efficiency. But what Hayek is saying is that market competition is a discovery procedure. The whole purpose of letting market competition take place is because we as a society, we don't have the knowledge or information required to plan economies. And it is precisely when you have the three Ps, leading to the three I's. You have that market competition where businesses fail if they don't succeed, and successful businesses don't get penalized heavily. Then you would have the kind of through this process of market competition, that's where you know exactly what is it that consumers in the economy value versus what they do not,
So,
right?
so ironically, right, okay, Austrian economics, right, is actually a more radical critique of neoclassical economics than behavioral economics, right? Because behavioral economics, for all its claims to be different, is still wedded within the framework of neoclassical economics, right? You are not Superman, but you're expected to be, right? But Austrian economists like us, we are saying that you are not Superman and you are not expected to be Superman, right? You don't have to be Superman. You don't have to be fully rational and have perfect information, all those, features of Homo economicus in order to operate in the market, right? The market, right, helps to facilitate the actions of people who can be very, very stupid, who can be very, very dumb, right? And somehow we still have economic coordination, right? So that's the difference between the framework that we paint and behavioral economics.
Right. So maybe I understand that Singaporean students tend to have some kind of aversion to too abstract theory, right? So maybe if I could give one example, assuming like for example you had a very important good or resource that society needs, right? You could try and supply it either one of two ways. You could have a policymaker come in and say, okay, I'm allocating a $1 billion budget, and then I'll give it to a private company, and that private company will just produce it and sell it. Or you can actually give it to this $1 billion budget to companies in the private sector and let them compete amongst themselves, right? And maybe through that competitive process, you will find that, hey, you know what? Actually, $1 billion is way too much. Society doesn't actually value that that consumer good so much. But how do you actually know that the budget of 100 billion is too much? You can't really know until you have that market competitive process, right? And then consumers say, you know what, I don't really like this. And then you let businesses fold. And when businesses fold, that's when you reach some kind of a equilibrium, so to speak, where you realize that from this fierce market competition, you know what, this is the optimal amount that we need. And that maybe will change over time because of technological changes, consumer preferences changing, but we don't know until we have that market competition take place. So we're almost at the end of the slide, but you skipped one slide, Bryan, actually. We're almost at the end of the presentation. So Geert Gigerenzer is a very famous behavioral economist. He wrote this book in the I believe it was the 80s, called Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart, right? I would encourage all of you who are interested in behavioral economics to just go and read the first chapter of this book. Because what Gigerenzer is saying is that the modern behavioral economists, they just get so much of what economics is about wrong. Essentially, what behavioral economics, and this goes back to our point again, right? That you have like the behavioral economics project is still wedded to the neoclassical project, and Gigerenzer is saying the same thing, right? Because behavioral economists, their analysis doesn't account for the institutional context. You can never really tell when someone is behaving irrationally or rationally by just looking at their actions. You have to study their actions within the context of the environment, right? So there's a very famous example where if you have an alien look in a train station, right, in the middle of the peak hour, and you will see like thousands of people walking across, to the alien, it would seem very, very silly. Like, why is it that suddenly when the clock strikes 6, suddenly there's like so many people moving? What are they doing? Right? It seems very irrational. But to us, of course, it's not irrational because we know that these people are going to work. We know that in the corporate world, people get off work at 6. So you see, when you study actions within the context of their environment, that's where it makes sense, right? And that's what in the second bullet point, I bolded, that's what we call ecological rationality. Rather than being seen as unreliable coping mechanisms, heuristics serve as useful guides of human action according to standards of ecological rationality. So ecological is meaning the institutional context of where those actions are taking place. Without studying the background factors, you can never really tell where someone is behaving rationally or irrationally. But what behavioral economists, the modern ones at least, do is that they have a theory. Homo economicus is your benchmark, Superman is your benchmark, and you're saying that if you deviate from this, you are assumed to be irrational without any kind of accounting for the background factors that these actions are taking place. So I think do you want to take this slide?
I don't think we need to talk about this unless anyone has questions about whether or not big data is able to plan the economy with the use of supercomputers and AI and technology. We're happy to answer this later, I think. But I think we'll keep our remarks there for now. So most of what we have shared in today's presentation is actually in our book. Okay, and the book is actually available now for pre-order. It will be on sale officially next month in December. Yeah, right. So this is a link tree. There's a QR code, right? We are putting in the links now in the chat. We'll add you into a newsletter as usual. Yeah, I think we're very, very happy to have more Q&A. I believe now, please challenge us, right, with your questions, with your disagreements, and we will answer it.